Namo Buddhai, Namo Dhammai, Namo Sanghai. Jai Bhim to all and welcome you all in Navayana Buddhist Sangha short dialogue. Today we will going to discuss on the very fundamental concept Paticca-samuppada, which is known as dependent origination, and we have with us Venerable Professor Bodhi to reflect on this very fundamental and basic concept in Buddhism called Paticca-samuppada, a dependent origination. I request Professor Bodhi to reflect on this concept.
Thank you, Sujit. This is one of the most difficult conceptual framework within Buddhism. And the difficulty lies because it demands us to think very differently about everything from dukkha to anatta and even to anicca. We generally translate the Paticca-samuppada as referring to the 12 links of dependent origination and cessation. Because what Shakyamuni did was he found out that it was both origination, arising, and also the possibility of cessation, stopping. Now, if you were to listen to what people are discussing about and what do they talk about and how do they teach the Paticca-samuppada, because of the way it has come in the suttas, there's a tendency to talk about it, especially the 12 links of Avija, Sankara, Vijnana, Nama, Rupa, Salayatana, Phassa, Vedana, Tanha, Upadana, Bhava, Jati, Jaramana. These 12 concepts have been translated as to mean Avija, meaning ignorance or ignorance, to ignore something. And the interpretation is that this ignorance is the ignorance of the Four Noble Truths, of the truths of suffering, of the cause and origin, the cessation, and the path out of suffering. When you refer to Sankara, you're generally referring to fabrications. As in, by fabrication, we mean a process of manufacturing or inventing something. Something is taking place that is manufacturing certain kind of realities. When we are talking about Vijnana, generally the translation is consciousness, that now there's a state of consciousness. Now we have to be careful not to speak about consciousness the way we have it in our life, but consciousness is that sensation becomes conscious. There's a consciousness to sensation. There's a consciousness into this fabrication process. By Nama Rupa, generally the translation is name and matter, or name and substance. It is this that becomes the basis for Salayatana, the rise of what is called the 5 senses in the body that is present, and what is called the thinking element or the mind element. Now, it does not have to be that all people will have to have all the 5 senses. Such is the way reality manifests, that some people will have 5 senses, some people will have 4 senses, but generally it is spoken of as the 6th sense door, which means 5 senses plus 1, the mind element. With this Salayatana as the base, it gives rise to what we call Phassa. The minute you begin to have these 6 sense door, it comes into contact with the realities around you. And the minute this contact comes in, Phassa, Vedana arises. That is, feelings begins to arise. And these feelings can be pleasant, can be unpleasant, it can be neutral feelings. Then the body begins to experience this pleasantness, the unpleasantness. And with the experience of Vedana, or the pleasant and unpleasant feeling, comes what we call tanha, the craving that comes for some of these feelings. Sometimes people crave both the pleasant, some people even crave for the unpleasant also sometimes. And with the craving process, with this craving that comes in, comes what you call upadana, clinging. We begin to cling to what we crave. We want to cling to what we experience as unpleasant. And in this clinging, what you call becoming takes place. So bhava, which is something that arises because of the necessary condition called upadana, is what is called the becoming of the human being. Now the human being comes alive and comes into existence. And the minute this being comes into existence, this being begins to experience what is called jati, jara, marana, death or birth, aging and death. And the minute you begin to experience this birth, aging and death, Shakyamuni explains that it is from here arises this whole realm of what you call stress, lamentation, grief, sorrow, pain, despair, and people begin to suffer. So if you were to look at the very, in the very normative, in a very accepted understanding of the Paticca-samuppada, this is exactly how it is kind of interpreted. Now, if you listen to the discussions and the reflections of practitioners and theorists in India, you will begin to realize that people are beginning to realize that this is a beautiful theory that helps explain how suffering and dukkha came to be. Where's this whole gamut of suffering arising from? What are the source of suffering? And in that sense, people speak about the Paticca-samuppada as the most sophisticated theoretical frame that explains dukkha and suffering. And in that sense, the Paticca-samuppada has this interpretation from a dukkha perspective. So people who see the Paticca-samuppada as a theory that explains suffering or dukkha is talking it from a dukkha perspective of the Paticca-samuppada. Now, there are also other interpretations. If you listen to the people who are talking, they are discussing that there is not only, the Paticca-samuppada is not only a theory about suffering or the origin of the suffering and the very source of suffering, but it also is a theory of anatta, or the non-self, or the no-self, or the not-self. Because the Paticca-samuppada also explains as the fundamental framework of how the I arises and how this I is merely just nothing but anatta. And in the Buddhist way we speak about it, when we refer to anatta, Shakyamuni told us that if you go into what you conceive as the self, and he named 5 processes: form, sensation, perception, fabrications, and consciousness, you will realize that actually there is nothing there at all. There's a non-substantive self. It does not exist in and by itself. If you go deeper, it's actually no self at all. So for some people who are looking at the Paticca-samuppada as a theory to explain anatta, they have a very different interpretations about the 12 links of dependent origination. For them, avijja is not ignorance, but avijja is no mind, no mental activity, the insentience. Sankara is not fabrication, but sensation. Vijnana is not consciousness merely, but perception. Namarupa is not name and matter, but image and name. Salayatana is the sixth sense feel. Phassa is not merely contact, but contact plus cognition to cognize reality. Vedana is not merely feelings, but a feeling that is experienced both in terms of multiple kinds of feelings of the pleasant, the unpleasant, and the neutral plus the unpleasant, the pleasant plus the unpleasant feelings. These are the kind of multiple feelings that you begin to experience them if you have this body that you are in terms of your sensations. And from this particular pleasant and unpleasant, complex unpleasant feeling, you begin to have what is called tanha. And tanha is interpreted not merely as craving, but an emotional reaction to these feelings of pleasant and unpleasant. And it's from tanha arises upadana. Upadana is not merely clinging, but the personalization of these feelings. This is happening to me. And the minute you say this is happening to me, bhava arises. The personality, the I, the construct called I begins to arise. And because this I has nowhere else to know, the first thing that it does is tries to understand this body and what this body goes through. And the minute it looks at the body, it sees something called a past, a present, and a future. And from there, it creates the notion of birth, aging, and death. So if you're to look at it from an anatta perspective, then the Paticca-samuppada is a very sophisticated theory that explains to you who is this bhava, who is this I, and why this I is anatta. Now, if you go deeper into the debate, you will realize that people are discussing even something more fundamental. And they are looking at the Paticca-samuppada not only merely a theoretical framework to explain dukkha and anatta, but to explain one more thing called the anicca perspective. And by anicca's perspective, they are going into the fundamental, the Paticca-samuppada, the fundamental law of the universe or even of the multiverse. It is the origin stories of the Buddhists. If someone asks us, what is your origin story? For the Buddhists, it is the Paticca-samuppada. If you ask other people from other religions and other faiths and other belief systems, what is your origin story? Some will say that the origin of the universe is because there's a creator God. And this is known generally sometimes as the ontological argument. Some will say that there's a first unmoving principle, and it's from this first unmoving principle that matter and motion begins to take place. This is generally called the cosmological argument. There are some who will say this world came to be because something called the intelligent design, the great design. If you look at the universe, if you look at the human body, if you look at your DNA, if you look at, if you go to the level of the subatomic, there is intelligence everywhere. There must be some intelligent mind that is creating all of this. And science has even come up with its own understanding of the origin of the universe with the Big Bang theory. Now, each of them have their own ways of understanding how this world came to be. How do the Buddhists understand how this world came to be? For Buddhists, the world is not governed by a creator God who has the concept of God and the devil, or heaven and earth and and hell, or by a first principle, or by a great design, or even probably by a we come close to science in the sense of the Big Bang. But Buddhism, if you were to ask a Buddhist how this world came to be, it is not because of this God and the devil and the heaven and the earth. It's because of a law. The world is governed by a law. This whole experience we have is governed by a law. It came through a law, and this law is called the Paticca-samuppada. So, before we go into the anicca perspective of the Paticca-samuppada, there's one thing that we need to know, and this is a methodological proposition which was put forth by Shakyamuni himself. And it's generally known as the idapakayata, which is the this/that conditionality. In a Buddhist way of looking at the world, nothing is permanent, nothing is static. Everything that exists arises because of the necessary conditions. When this is, that arises, that is. From the arising of this comes the arising of that. With avijja as the fundamental necessary premise, arises sankhara. With sankhara as the necessary condition, arises vijnana. With vijnana as necessary condition, arises namarupa. When this is not, that is not. When there is no avijja, then sankhara does not arise. From the cessation of this comes the cessation of that. With the cessation of sankhara comes the cessation of vijnana, comes the cessation of namarupa, and so on and so forth, till you complete all the 12 links of dependent origination and cessation. Now, this methodological process is very important because this has to be embedded in a Buddhist mind. In a Buddhist mind, everything exists simply because of the requisite necessary conditions. Without these conditions, you will not have the reality the way we have. And the idapakayata is generally an embodiment of the causal evolutionary principle of the totality of reality. So the Buddhist way of looking at the origin of the universe is rooted in this way of thinking. And it's a very difficult way of thinking because it doesn't come naturally to human being. You have to really sit and meditate and think and sit and cultivate and think. There's so much of bhavana that you have to engage with in order for you to be able to begin to co-opt this as a way of looking at the world. Now, the anicca perspective, on the other hand, goes a little bit deeper because now it explains the totality of the rise and the origin of the universe itself, or the multiverse. Let's speak about the multiverse. We should not reduce from a Buddhist framework to a single universe. They're probably multiverse. And the Buddha speaks so much about all of these processes. Avijja, within the anicca perspective, does not refer to ignorance or no mind or no mental activity, but it refers to the unmanifested, the unborn, the unarisen. There is a beautiful sutta called the Udana Sutta in which Shakyamuni was explaining this particular part of that reality. And in that sense, avijja is translated as non-knowing. In this state where you are unborn, you're unrisen, unvisited, there is a state of non-knowing the reality as it is. Now, we should not end here because if you go deep into the teachings of Shakyamuni, Shakyamuni also speaks about one particular realm of reality called nothingness, and neither perception nor non-perception. So avijja is we have to be very careful when we interpret avijja. From a Buddhist perspective, we have to go very deep especially if we link it with the jhanas, the arupa jhanas, the non-material jhanas of nothingness, and the neither perception nor non-perception. There are many more realities available in the avijja realm. But with avijja as a necessary condition, Shakyamuni told us that sankara arises. And sankara is referred to as, spoken in all compound things that comes to be, goes through what is called the inconceivably rapid movement of rising, peaking, and passing away. Upada tithi bhanga. So Shakyamuni says, with avijja as necessary condition of the unborn arisen, arises these particles, arises these compound things that rise, peaks, passes away, rise, peaks, passes away, and so fast that you cannot measure them. You can experience them, but you can't even measure them. And with this as a necessary condition, arises what is called sensory consciousness. By sensory consciousness, we are talking about small particles. There's a beautiful word, especially among the Myanmaris. It is not there in the Pali Canon, which is used word called kalapa or rupa kalapa, the smallest possible particle with properties. So when we are referring to vijnana, we're not referring to this kind of a consciousness that we generally speak about, aware and awakened, that we are talking to each other. You know? Instead, you're referring to small particles called kalapa with properties and moving around all over the place, filling the universe, filling this multiverse. And with this as a necessary condition arises Namarupa. And Namarupa is not merely name and matter, the way it is interpreted from a dukkha perspective, nor perception, nor image and name from an anatta perspective. But Namarupa from an anicca perspective refers to form, matter, and substance. Now, from this so-called vijnana, the sensation and the sense elements with consciousness, arises form. Now you begin to see the world in terms of substance and matter. There's a tree, there's a hill, there's a river, the form starts arising. And from Namarupa as a base, Salayatana arises, the sixth sense door. And the sixth sense door, as I said, from an anicca perspective, refers to a multiple process of 5 senses plus mano and chitta. Mano is the mind element, and chitta is this element that basically begins the fabrication process. So generally, this agent that cognizes, this agent that thinks, this agent that is accompanied by multiple factors, that organizes the world, organizes meaning, organizes language, the meaning-making process generally we refer to as the chitta. And with Salayatana as the necessary condition arises what is called phassa. And phassa here, from an anicca perspective, is also contact with other form, matter, and substance that exists. And it opens up what you call the sixth sense door. Now, this is a necessary condition arises Vedana. And by Vedana, in the anicca perspective, it is spoken of as a reaction. There's a reaction that takes place at this particular realm. And this reaction in terms of Vedana, for instance, is a sense of what you understand called sensation. And this sensation is experienced both in the realms of the pleasant and the unpleasant. But this is experienced within the self. You know, all of us begin to explain these within the self. Now, the mind has not really come into existence. Nothing has come to it. We're just experiencing it at the bodily process. And with this so-called Vedana that takes place, tanha arises. And tanha, is this craving and aversion that happens from that reaction that takes place, especially at the bodily realm. So the minute you have craving for the pleasant, aversion for the unpleasant, and sometimes you have there's no feeling at all, especially when it's neutral feelings, you're just going on, you know. So this is generally what is referred to as tanha. Now with tanha as a necessary condition, we have upadana. And from upadana means now we begin to have attachments and personalization of the craving and the aversion. And we begin to say, this is happening to me. This is me. The minute you say this is me, bhava arises. And bhava is the I, the construct called I. You know, the personality. With the personalization arises the personality. And anybody who comes from psychology will tell you the difference between temperament and personality. Personality is a construct. You can change the personality. There's something called personality training. You can change the way people become, what kind of personalities they have, because it is moldable. It is a conditioning, a social conditioning process. You can train yourself to be. So from this upadana arises bhava. From personalization arises this personality, the I. And this I is merely a construct. Now, when this I arises, it doesn't know itself because it's anatta. It doesn't know itself. It doesn't have a life in and for itself. So it identifies, as I said, with jati, jara, marana, the past, the present, and the future, in which birth, aging, and death is fundamental to the way this I begins to understand. Now it tries to understand, and interestingly, this I doesn't know itself. It doesn't know itself because this I is just a construct. It's living in the world of constructs, living in the world of languages, living in the world of words. And language itself is a binary process. And this I tries to understand the past. And the only thing it understands about the past is the memories that are available, the events that it experiences. And when it looks at the future, it thinks about the imaginary future, the fantasies and so on, from that what I can be. But this I, because it doesn't know itself, it can never experience the now. It can never experience, because it's living in that world that is an imaginary I in an imaginary world, and can never experience what is happening in my body right now. It cannot be totally present to what is happening. And it's constantly either in the past or in the future, either in the nice and the good and the hurtful and the painful memories, or in a beautiful future, or in probably even in a sad future. So the one point that needs to be understood by this I, this construct I, is that it is because of this, living in the world of the binary, living in the world of relativity, living in the world of language, concepts and categories, it cannot comprehend itself. And this is the source of what you call dukkha, or suffering. Now, what is important to kind of go deeper here a little bit is just to say this much, that when you cannot experience the reality as it is now and always live either in the past or in the future, suffering is to be understood as this I's inability to experience something called, it's this I's ability to experience something called fear. Now, this fear is very fundamental in the Buddhist way of looking. The first fear that all of us have is this fear of death. So the future where death will occur is something that generates fear. And when someone is living at the edge of probably nearly dying, that fear that takes over the body is tremendous. And suffering arises from this fear of death. But it is not only that. The fear also arises from something called the crisis of mind. Some people who have experienced the crisis of mind will explain to you what suffering is all about. Then there are other layers of suffering. It is not only death or the crisis of mind, but it is also social suffering, where people experience poverty, discrimination, structural suffering, where one group of people experience fear because the oppression of one group on the other. Historical suffering, because one group inferiorizes another group and impose a sense of bodily, physical, violent fear on them. There's existential suffering that comes about because of we do not know what's going to happen tomorrow. There can be an earthquake, there can be a cyclone, things can just go haywire in a moment. So there are many, many sufferings that people begin to experience. And this particular realm, which Shakyamuni taught, says it is in this realm that we experience stress, lamentation, grief, sorrow, pain, distress, despair, anxiety. And all of us experience. Now, all of us need not experience in the same intensity. But if you go into the fundamental basis of it, this is the source of how this suffering base arises. So if you look at it from an anicca perspective, anicca not only explains why suffering arises, why there is no self, but it explains the origin of everything. It's called the theory of everything. How exactly from nothingness arises matter, form, and substance, arises sensations, arises feelings, arises a construct called I, and how this I goes through a realm of suffering. Dukkha as a state of sadness, a realm of sadness that we all have to experience as beings. So it is in that particular sense, I think we need to begin to think a little bit more about what we understand called the Paticca-samuppada. It is not only to be reduced to only one way of understanding, because the Paticca-samuppada actually is the origin story of the Buddhists. It's the most fundamental framework of Buddhism. It informs everything that we basically do and how we live and how we see and experience the world. So it is a very difficult idea, and we need to take a lot of time to think about this. So at least for today, I think just to kind of lay the framework so that we begin to think a little bit more deeply and discuss and practice more deeply should be enough, I think. So with these few words, with humility and with the possibility that there might be many more ways of interpreting, I will stop here for today.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Venerable Professor Bodhi sir, for this new and broader perspective of this Paticca-samuppada, what we call a dependent origination through the anicca, anatta, and dukkha perspective. Thank you very much, and thank you all for watching this video. We will come back again with a short dialogue in Navayana Buddhist Sangha short dialogue series. Thank you very much.